So we've been talking a lot about moving air in and out and the factors that affect that. But what about this whole gas exchange thing? So the exchange of oxygen and CO2, carbon dioxide, between the alveolar air and the pulmonary blood occurs through passive diffusion. Now remember, passive diffusion is the movement from more to less. So passive diffusion is governed by the behavior of gases, and we have two gas laws, Dalton's law and Henry's law, that help us to understand how gas moves. Dalton's law is important for understanding how gas move down their concentration gradients by diffusion. Henry's law helps us to understand how the solubility of a gas relates to its diffusion. So let's look briefly at these two. So Dalton's law states that each gas in a mixture of gases exerts its own pressure just as if there were no other gases in the mixture. So the pressure of a specific gas in a mixture is called its partial pressure. Now you'll see this many times as P with subscript, and the subscript is the chemical formula for the gas. For example, PO2, partial pressure of oxygen, PCO2, partial pressure of CO2. Carbon dioxide. Now remember, atmospheric gases and the gases within our lungs are a mixture of gases. So each gas has its own partial pressure, and the total pressure of the mixture is simply calculated by adding all the partial pressures together. And atmospheric air is a mixture of gases. There's nitrogen and oxygen and argon, carbon dioxide, and a little bit of water vapor as well, and some other gases that are in very, very small quantities. But of course, we'll talk primarily about oxygen, CO2, and a little bit about nitrogen. So each gas is going to diffuse across a permeable membrane from the area where its higher partial pressure is greater to where the partial pressure is less. The difference in the partial pressure, when it's greater, the greater the rate of diffusion. So the greater the pressure difference, the faster these gases will diffuse. Henry's law says that the quantity of a gas that will dissolve in a liquid, remember your body's liquid, is proportional to the partial pressure of the gas and its solubility. In body fluids, the ability of a gas to stay in solution is greater when the partial pressure is higher and when it has a high solubility in water. The higher the partial pressure of a gas over the liquid, the higher the solubility, the more that gas will stay in the solution. So compared to oxygen, much more CO2 is dissolved in the blood plasma because it's about 24 times greater in its solubility than oxygen. So an example of Henry's law you've all seen when you drink a soft drink. So you unscrew the lid and the soft drink makes that hissing sound when the top is taken. If you look at the container, bubbles are going to be rising through the liquid even for a bit after you take the lid off. That's because the dissolved gas in the carbonated beverage is CO2. Because the soft drink is bottled or even canned under high pressure and then capped, the CO2 is going to remain dissolved as long as the container is closed. But once you loosen the cap and remove it, the pressure decreases and the gases begin to bubble out of the solution. So Henry's law explains two conditions resulting from changes in the solubility of nitrogen gas in body fluids. As the total air pressure increases, the partial pressure of all gases increase too. So when a scuba diver breathes air under high pressure from a tank, the nitrogen in the mixture can have very serious negative effects because the partial pressure of nitrogen is higher in a mixture of compressed air in the tank than in air at sea level pressure. So a considerable amount of nitrogen dissolves in the plasma and in the interstitial fluid. These high amounts of dissolved nitrogen can make you feel sort of giddy, very much like alcohol intoxication. And this condition is called nitrogen narcosis or rapture of the deep. If a diver comes to the surface too slowly, the dissolved nitrogen can be eliminated by exhaling it. But sometimes they come up too quickly and the nitrogen comes out of solution too quickly and forms gas bubbles in the tissues. This results in decompression sickness, or what we commonly call the bends. The effects of decompression sickness typically result from bubbles in the nervous tissue and can be mild or severe depending on the number of bubbles that have formed. Symptoms can include joint pain, especially in the arms and the legs, the bends, dizziness, shortness of breath, extreme fatigue, paralysis, and unconsciousness. A major application that is related to Henry's law is the use of a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. Hyper over baric pressure. So this is using pressure to cause more oxygen to dissolve in the blood. It's a very effective technique in treating patients that are infected with anaerobic bacteria, such as the bacteria that causes tetanus or gangrene. Anaerobic bacteria can't live in the presence of a lot of free oxygen. So a person undergoing hyperbaric oxygenation is placed into the hyperbaric chamber, which contains oxygen at a pressure greater than atmospheric pressure. As body tissues pick up the oxygen, the bacteria is killed. Hyperbaric chambers can also be used for treating certain heart disorders, carbon monoxide poisoning, gas embolisms, crush injuries, cerebral edema, certain hard-to-treat bone infections that are caused by anaerobic bacteria, smoke inhalation, near drowning, asphyxia, vascular insufficiencies, and burns. All right, after discussing Henry and Dalton's laws of the way gases move, let's talk about the way gases move in the respiratory system. So we talked about pulmonary ventilation being the first step of respiration. So let's move now into the second step, which is external expiration or pulmonary gas exchange. So it's the diffusion of oxygen from the air in the alveoli of the lungs to the blood in the pulmonary capillaries, and the diffusion of CO2 in the opposite direction. External respiration in the lungs will convert deoxygenated blood coming from the right side of the heart, remember that's our pulmonary circuit, into oxygenated blood that's going to return to the left side of the heart, the systemic circuit. As blood flows through the pulmonary capillaries, it picks up oxygen from the alveolar air and unloads CO2 into the alveolar air. Even though we usually call this process gas exchange, it's not really exchange because each gas moves independently from the area where its partial pressure is higher to where its partial pressure is lower. So oxygen diffuses from alveolar air where its partial pressure is higher into the blood in the pulmonary capillaries where the partial pressure of oxygen is lower. While the oxygen's diffusing from the alveolar air into the deoxygenated blood, CO2 is diffusing in the opposite direction. So the partial pressure of CO2 of deoxygenated blood is higher. The partial pressure of alveolar air is lower. So because of this difference in the partial pressure of CO2, carbon dioxide moves from deoxygenated blood into the alveoli until the pressure of the blood decreases. And of course, when we exhale, that CO2 leaves the alveoli. So let's talk about internal respiration. The left ventricle is going to pump that oxygenated blood into the aorta and through the systemic arteries out to the systemic capillaries. The exchange of oxygen and CO2 between those systemic capillaries and tissue cells is called internal respiration or systemic gas exchange. As oxygen leaves the bloodstream, oxygenated blood is going to be converted to deoxygenated blood. It's losing oxygen. Unlike external respiration, which occurs only in the lungs, internal respiration only occurs in the tissues throughout the body. So the partial pressure of oxygen of blood pumped into the systemic capillaries is higher than the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues because your body are constantly using oxygen when they're making ATP. Due to this pressure difference, Oxygen is going to diffuse out of the capillaries into the tissue cells. While oxygen diffuses from the capillaries into the tissue cells, CO2, yep, you got it, is moving in the opposite direction. Because when tissue cells are constantly making ATP, they're producing lots and lots of CO2. So the partial pressure of CO2 in tissue cells is higher than it is in the systemic capillary blood. So that leads CO2 to diffuse from the tissue cells through the interstitial fluid into those systemic capillaries. The deoxygenated blood is then going to return to the right side of the heart, where it's pumped out to the lungs, and another cycle of respiration begins. Because oxygen doesn't dissolve well in water, only about 1.5% of the oxygen that we inhale is actually dissolved in the plasma. About 98.5% is carried by hemoglobin. Now remember, the heme portion of the hemoglobin contains 4 atoms of iron, and each of those is capable of bonding to a molecule of oxygen. So each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygens. The most important factor that determines how much oxygen can bind to that hemoglobin is the partial pressure of the oxygen. So the higher the partial pressure of oxygen, the more oxygen is going to combine with hemoglobin. So when the hemoglobin is bound to 4 oxygens, we call that fully saturated. Okay, fully saturated. It can only carry 4, and it's carrying 4. So when the pressure of oxygen is high, hemoglobin bonds with large amounts of oxygen and is almost 100% saturated. When the partial pressure of oxygen is low, hemoglobin is only partially saturated. So in other words, the greater the partial pressure of oxygen, the more oxygen binds to hemoglobin, until all of the available hemoglobin molecules are saturated. So in pulmonary capillaries, where the partial pressure of oxygen is high, a lot of oxygen binds to hemoglobin. Should be pretty self-explanatory, right? In the tissue capillaries, where the partial pressure of oxygen is lower, hemoglobin doesn't bind to as much oxygen, and the dissolved oxygen that's free in the plasma is unloaded through diffusion out into tissue cells. Now, carbon dioxide is carried a little differently. So about 7% of the carbon dioxide is dissolved in the plasma, about 23% is carried by hemoglobin, and 70%, by far the majority, is carried as bicarbonate ions. So we'll look at each of these and how they bind to that hemoglobin and what factors cause that hemoglobin to bind to them. It should be obvious that the partial pressure of oxygen is the most important factor that determines how much oxygen saturation there is of the hemoglobin. But there are other factors that influence the tightness or the affinity with which the hemoglobin is going to bind that oxygen. So higher affinity means that the hemoglobin binds more tightly to the oxygen. Lower affinity, the hemoglobin binds less tightly. So the changing affinity of the hemoglobin for the oxygen is an example of how homeostatic mechanisms can adjust body activities to meet cellular needs. Each one of these makes sense if you keep in mind that metabolically active tissues need oxygen and produce more CO2. Okay, so pH. As acidity increases, that means pH is decreasing, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen decreases, and oxygen dissociates or comes off the hemoglobin more easily. In other words, increasing acidity enhances the unloading of oxygen from the hemoglobin molecule. The main acids that we produce metabolically are lactic acid and carbonic acid. Lower pH drives oxygen off hemoglobin. And remember, acids have lower pH. So this makes more oxygen available for tissue cells. Also, the partial pressure of CO2, because CO2 can bind to hemoglobin. So the effect is pretty similar to that of acids. As the partial pressure of CO2 rises, hemoglobin releases more oxygen. Partial pressure of CO2 and pH are related factors because low blood pH or acidity results from high CO2. As CO2 enters the blood, a lot of it's going to be temporarily converted to lactic acid, as we'll see in a few minutes. Or, I'm sorry, to carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is formed in red blood, or that's formed in red blood cells, is going to dissociate or break down to release hydrogen ions and bicarbs. As the hydrogen ion concentration increases, remember, pH decreases. So if you increase your partial pressure of CO2, that's going to produce more acids, because that CO2 bonds to water and creates that carbonic acid. We'll see this equation in just a moment. Temperature can also change the affinity. So as temperature increases, the amount of oxygen that the hemoglobin releases increases. So heat's a byproduct of a lot of our metabolic reactions of all of our cells, and the heat released by contracting muscle cells raises body temperature. Metabolically active cells need more oxygen and create more acids and more heat. The acids and the heat promote the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin. Fever causes a very similar result. Hypothermia, lowered body temperature, lowers cellular metabolism, so the need for oxygen is reduced and more oxygen stays bound to that hemoglobin molecule. There's also another type of hemoglobin called fetal hemoglobin. It differs in its structure and also in its affinity for oxygen. Fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen. So when oxygen level is low, fetal hemoglobin can carry up to 30% more oxygen than the maternal hemoglobin. As maternal blood enters the placenta, oxygen is easily transferred to the fetal blood. Because of this, fetal blood can be a very effective treatment for sickle cell anemia, where oxygen loses some of its affinity, or hemoglobin loses some of its affinity based to the malformed, deformed hemoglobin molecules, so the oxygen doesn't bind as tightly. So if you give fetal hemoglobin, it binds more tightly and takes more of the oxygen. So this would probably be a good place to talk a little bit about carbon monoxide poisoning. So CO, not CO2. Carbon monoxide is a colorless and odorless gas that's found in exhaust fumes from our cars, from gas furnaces, some space heaters, and in tobacco smoke. It's a byproduct of the combustion of carbon-containing materials such as coal, gas, and wood. Carbon monoxide binds to the heme group of the hemoglobin, just like oxygen does, but the binding is over 200 times stronger than the binding of oxygen to that hemoglobin. So at a concentration very, very small, carbon monoxide will combine with the hemoglobin molecules and reduce its oxygen carry capacity by 50% or even greater at very, very low concentrations of carbon monoxide. Elevated blood levels of carbon monoxide cause carbon monoxide poisoning, which can cause the lips and the oral mucosa to appear bright red, which is the color of hemoglobin with carbon monoxide bound to it. If you don't have very prompt treatment, carbon monoxide poisoning is fatal because tissue oxygenation decreases. It is possible to rescue a victim of carbon monoxide poisoning if you catch them early by administering pure oxygen, which speeds up the separation of the carbon monoxide from that hemoglobin. I guess you could basically say it just outcompetes for those binding sites. And as I mentioned on a previous slide, we would come back to how the carbon dioxide is transported in the blood. And it's in three main forms: as dissolved carbon dioxide, and this is the smallest percentage, only about 70% is dissolved in the blood plasma. When it reaches the lungs, it diffuses into the alveolar air and is exhaled. The second form is in carbamino compounds. So this is about 23% of the CO2 combines with amino groups of amino acids and proteins that are found in the blood, and when it does, it forms carbamino compounds. Because the most prevalent protein in the blood is hemoglobin that's inside the red blood cells, most of the CO2 transported in this way is bound to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin that's bound CO2 is termed carbaminohemoglobin. Don't you love it when the terms make sense? The formation of carbaminohemoglobin is influenced greatly by the partial pressure of CO2. So, for instance, in tissue capillaries, the partial pressure of CO2 is relatively high, so that promotes the formation of carbaminohemoglobin. But in pulmonary capillaries, CO2 partial pressure is low, and the CO2 readily splits apart from the globin and enters the alveoli by diffusion, and boom, we exhale and they're gone. The third way that CO2 is carried is the greatest percentage of the CO2, about 70%, and that's transported in the blood plasma as bicarbonate ions. So as CO2 diffuses into the systemic capillaries and enters the red blood cells, it reacts with the water in the blood and forms carbonic acid. So if you look at the equation, carbon dioxide with water forms carbonic acid. Okay, so it accumulates, forms the carbonic acid, and carbonic acid dissociates very easily because this is an unstable molecule. When it dissociates, it releases hydrogen ions that makes it by definition an acid, and bicarb ions. Now, as you accumulate CO2, there's plenty of water available, so more bicarbonate is formed, more hydrogen ions are released, and this is why when you held your breath, you went into respiratory acidosis. You retained CO2, it bound chemically with the water, created carbonic acid, which is unstable, which broke down to release more hydrogen ions. That state of respiratory acidosis triggered your respiratory centers in your brainstem to cause you to exhale.